My office is on the corner here of this building, and it looks out at this oak tree. In 1988, that was a fully leafed out, healthy oak tree at about 150 years old. The tree started showing decline up in the upper canopy. And then I got out into some woodlots that we have here, and I realized that those trees in those woodlots, which had been left here after the settlers came, the woods that are left here are pretty sick. These trees are the oldest living things in our area. These ancient representatives of a time that we could never know. And so I got to talking to Ed Collins, and we were talking about what was this county like?
If we go back far enough, when the ice sheets are beginning to melt, there are going to be two great forces that shape the structure and the composition of the area's ecosystem. And those two great forces are going to be fire and topography. If the terrain's level or gently rolling, there's going to be more frequent fires, and over time that's going to wipe out all of the timber. It'll be replaced by grasslands, it'll be replaced by wetlands, it'll be replaced by communities that are able to handle that frequent fire return interval. Now, oaks are somewhat fire resistant, and in the end of all the trees, it's the oaks that become the masters of handling that kind of dynamic and intense ecological force. Now, the more rugged the landscape, the more those features mitigated and even to some degree muted the effects of that fire. And it retained in its wake, because of that topography, open oak savannas, and in extreme cases where the topography was truly rugged and more fire protected, true oak forest, which is rare in McHenry County. So when we look at those areas and we look at how they burned historically, we see that once we get outside of the prairie areas, those areas we're looking at that have trees are composed of oaks that have small openings within them, and they're interspersed with these wetlands and small prairies. So a rich mosaic of ecological communities across the landscape.
If you study ecosystems in which our native oaks were a part for much of the Holocene, the last 10,000 years, you find a world in which fire is a very common event. It's a very hard life for trees. Most trees are killed by fire. Even oaks suffer from intense and frequent fires. And so you have a world that is a pretty hard life for a tree, and only the hardiest of trees can even survive at all. And the hardiest of trees in those fire landscapes are the oaks. If you take the same landscape and you stop the fires, then every surviving tree at that point has an easier life. Very, very quickly the oaks stop reproducing. Their reproduction is based on the openness that comes from that fire landscape. So what that means is our woodlands have no reproducing oaks anymore. Acres and acres and acres of them, full of thousands and thousands of acorns, and yet no young oak trees, because they're all full of other trees. They have so much shade that the oaks can't germinate and reproduce.
In 15 or 20 years, there might be no oak trees remaining at least on private land in this region, because the decline is happening so rapidly and there aren't young oaks regenerating to take the place of the old ones as they die. But, I mean, when you look at those early survey notes that the public land surveyors did, they recorded the trees. 95% of the trees that were recorded in those notes were oaks. 95%.
From 1837, which is the first series of maps that we have that records where oaks are at, to 1872, there's a 50% reduction in oaks. Most of them were cut down simply to make room for fields. But the material that was in a lot of those trees went to build barns, to build the framing on homes, to build fences. It's a wood culture, and that's an important thing to bear in mind. By 1939, when we actually have air photos to look at, we had still lost a tremendous amount of trees. We had lost another 32% of the cover in the county. And most of that was clearing for grazing land, clearing for firewood, and the beginning of development. Especially around the towns, you begin to see areas that are cleared simply to expand residential housing. But it really accelerates after 1940, and in particular after World War II. By the time you get to the 1950s and 60s, there's been a conversion across the whole country to corn and soybeans. And the equipment is getting larger. Smaller farms are being consolidated into larger farms. Fence lines removed. The small woodlots that might be in them removed, and they're consolidated into a single large unit. You know, you have Route 12 and you've got Route 14 that have long been arterials going into the city, and you've got the rail lines. And development begins to move out along those roadways and along those rail corridors. So by the time you hit the 1960s, McHenry County is beginning to experience the same type of growth as the rest of the suburban area, and that, of course, really accelerated in the 90s and after 2000.
Half of the homes in the county have been built in the last 25 years. That has put a pressure on the remaining resources. The threat for actual sort of clear cutting for destruction of these oak woods is going to be development.
I actually took the radius around the train tracks and started looking for trees. And when I found a clump of trees, I drove in to find out if there were houses for sale. So I bought 4 trees first and homes second, because you can always find homes, you can't always find trees.
When I started to really drive around the county and find my way around, I think I was consistently surprised by the combination of suburbia and agriculture. I really felt like I was on the fringe. I mean, I grew up in the suburbs of Philadelphia and I lived in Washington, D.C. It's very cluttered. It's very citified. I mean, there's not a grove of 10 trees anywhere unless you go out to the parks. You can appreciate them more out here because they're not quite so, they're out in the open. You know, and you go, there's a grove or there's a stand and there's, 10 right there, and you're driving along and all of a sudden, wow, look.
Some people consider this pretty far out, I mean, if you're looking at it from Chicago, for instance, and you're driving, but when you get here, you feel like you've come someplace different, like it's worth the trip. You've gotten here, there's some sort of serenity here because of some of these natural features that you just don't get just all over everywhere, that really makes it worth stopping.
I'm originally from Lake County, and so when I came out to McHenry County, my husband and I moved for his job. We came to McHenry County. I had this natural reaction of, this is absolutely gorgeous. You've got these rolling hills, you have these beautiful trees, you've got this farmland, and yet there's a quality of life in which I wanted everyone, to be able to participate in, and that's, and to protect. That's why I became a county board member, but also for my children. We had a couple of children at the time, and now we have 5. Our kids are outside all the time, and even, the winter is even better because of the ice skating and the sledding and so on. So, it's sometimes seriously, I do want to be like, would you just sit down and watch television so we have a moment's peace and mud isn't coming out? I mean, it's the reverse. But if you think about it, these cookie cutter homes where they just flatten everything, take away the trees, take away anything worthwhile to play with outside, well, who wants to be out there?
The problem what we've had in the past with the base housing developer is that they're so used to a certain size lot dictated by ordinance with various setbacks. So a lot of their housing product and a lot of their product is designed to fit those types. So that's where that regrading or mass grading came into play, because always we have these boxes and each box next to each other and with a a 6-inch or 12-inch grade difference, and so you fit the site to that particular product. That's the way it's always been done in the 70s and 80s. That's how the mindset goes.
In most cases, I mean, there are going to be exceptions, but in most cases, they're going to meet the minimum standard that's set by the local unit of government. They're not going to voluntarily go above and beyond that, unless it's in their interest from a dollar standpoint.
Land is an asset. It's a valuable, valuable asset. To say that, well, we could just leave this into farmland, in some cases is just not practical because it is got such value that it doesn't make sense.
I think a lot of it all started with the Industrial Revolution. I mean, industry and cities were born, and from that became an economic engine that grew out, and in order to sustain that, we developed neighborhoods, and they were all easily put together through rectangular north, south, east, west type streets in a grid pattern. That led into urban sprawl, and people wanted to get away from that, and so then they go out and find the best and cheapest way to develop property that gives us the highest base return, and it's now become an issue of impact.
If you take a look out, you won't see any oaks, but what you will see is where the stumps used to be. And they've all been ground out. Give you an idea of what these trees look like. We're now driving across what used to be a beautiful oak savanna, this parking lot. How about that? Walmart's moved to a bigger store.
We built this task force, the Land First Task Force, Land First Initiatives. Those two words just seem to boil it down, our goal for changing the way we develop in unincorporated McHenry County. Look at the land first. It makes perfect sense.
The land can really tell a story. The story being, this is the way it happens. So let's respect the way it happens and let's work around that.
You know, I am obviously one that believes that we can coexist with development and preservation of open space and preservation of these wonderful oak trees that have been here for many years before I was here. I look at McHenry County today as an opportunity for tomorrow.
In a lot of ways, it's a haunted landscape if you're an ecologist. You can see the old landscape underneath the modern one. You can drive McHenry County's bare fields and you can see just where the wetlands used to lie. And the same thing is true with oaks. If you drive an area that was primarily oak, you can see the old trees and the fence lines. You can see the small groves that were left for shade for the cattle or around the houses. And you can extrapolate on what that original landscape was like and where the trees were at and how dense they were and things like that. So very much a haunted landscape. And then there are the periodic ghosts in the fence line. You know, there may be areas where the understory of the oak groves, the plants that grew there, are long gone, even in the relic groves, because they've been grazed out or they've been shaded out. But every once in a while, you'll have one of those places where you'll find one of those ghosts of the past right there.
An oak tree is something everybody takes for granted. Oh, there's a beautiful oak tree over there in that park, and then that park, there's a pretty one over there. And you don't really think about the fact that they are disappearing.
If we just keep going on the way we've been going on, they won't be there. And we take it for granted now for what little is left. But I think when the last one would be cut down, people who don't care about it right now would care, and then it's too late.
There's no way these oaks are going to survive without human involvement, and that's where we're at now. The first generation were the big prairie oaks that were all cut down by the settlers. The second generation came up after the settlement, but that's the generation now that's pretty much gone, and we don't expect it to survive another 20 to 30 years in McHenry County. We are the third generation. We are the generation that now has to plant the acorns and plant the trees.
It's a long-term prospect. I mean, if it's not like seeding a prairie and, you know, you throw the seed out and in 3 years, a prairie. With an oak woodland, they're not even going to be producing acorns, the small trees that you plant. It's going to be at least 20 years.
I know it will be a long time before trees you plant today get big, but there will still be people there in 100 years. Why not give them these gifts of these big trees?
I don't know, I just like them. They're like big and green. They're fun. not all the time you get to be like smaller than something, so to me it's fun to have something bigger.
We're looking at a red oak here, and it's a tree that's easily 300 years old. It's interesting for not just for its size and its age, but if you look at it, you can see that it was multiple trunked at one time. And it's been growing for so long that those trunks have all fused one into another. There's no question this tree was here long before the first French explorers penetrated the Midwest. And we're overlooking the Fox River, which you can't see through the density of the trees here. But there's no question in my mind that when this was wide open, you could see all the way down to the river. Another clue to how open this was is behind us. And what you see is an old purple martin house. And martins live where it's wide open. And at one time, all of this brush was probably a grassy understory of flowers and sedges and grasses, and the martins did just fine. So all this is grown up in probably the last half century. Now, if you look at the lower branches, you can see some of them have died. Probably one of the best ones to see that on is over on this side of the tree. And that gives you an idea of just how high up the buckthorn had invaded. This area was cleared by volunteer stewards, and all of these lower branches had already died from the shading. We're looking at a piece of living history. The area that we're in here is called Lind Forest, and it's an unusual place in McHenry County. It's unusual for a number of reasons. One is the steepness of the slope. It's very close to being, or as close as you can get to being, a cliff in McHenry County. And facing north, it tends to be a much cooler slope, and a slope that's very much protected from fires, both historically and today. So what we see is actually a persistent red oak sugar maple forest here. And we're looking out over it. You can see the young sugar maples that are just turning that beautiful yellow. But the larger trees are red oaks. And because of its location and its protection from fire, a number of different species survived here that you don't find in other places in the county. As we move down slope here, and we have to be a little careful about moving down slope because you can move down slope a lot faster than you'd like if you miss your footing. This is an ironwood tree, and it grows in the understory of these types of forest, of oak and maple forest. And it grows very slowly. The rings, if you were to cut a tree like this, are very, very closely packed. And because of the slow growth of the tree, it's extremely hard, and that's where it gets its name, ironwood. And you can see that there are a number of ironwoods scattered across the slope as well. So we're looking down at one of the small remnants of oak forest that actually survives in the county. And they have persisted probably since about 8,000 years ago, and they only occur in these small pockets, these refugias, where the microclimate is cool enough that they can survive in it. Forest was never very common in McHenry County because of its history of fire, and where it did persist, it persisted in places like this that were very well protected on the landscape and didn't burn very frequently. I think you have to be introspective in a way to appreciate the beauty of the Midwest, the ability to appreciate that subtlety. And you have to learn to look. But when you do learn to look, there's a beauty to it that is equal to those mountains and the ocean and the coastlines.
Part of it is getting our head around this very different landscape that's so, so different from the forest, that concept of the forest we all grew up with. We expect forests to be closed communities and shady and have multiple layers of trees. And the idea that these, what look like forests today, were actually radically different ecosystems in which there may have been 4 or 5 medium-sized trees per acre, probably lots of little ones reproducing, and shrubbery here and there, young oaks or shrubs, whatever in between, but only a few trees per acre, very open, sunny places, just so starkly different than our expectations of the forest. It's very hard for people to get used to that.
So the oaks are creatures of the sunlight. If you go into a higher quality oak woods that hasn't been overrun with introduced species from other continents, you'll see the effect will be dappled sunlight, open areas, a very lit and beautiful place.
We keep trying to put oak trees into a forest ecosystem. We don't understand why they don't work. They weren't members, other than occasionally and briefly, they weren't members of forest ecosystems. They're persistent members of these open savanna barrens communities. Yet it's hard even for me to imagine that, walking through that landscape and trying to imagine what it looked like. They live in a different world. This is the world I grew up in. Is nature is over here, culture is over here. Maybe we need to back up and rethink the way we think about nature.
How do you put a value on a set of trees that were growing here when young men were marching off to fight at a place called Gettysburg? There is an intrinsic value to things that are that old and that alive, that have witnessed that kind of history, that it's very difficult to put a price tag on.
When I grew up, we were separate. Humans were separate from the natural world. It was something we dominated, something that we controlled, something that we... That language has changed. We're hearing it from younger people much more than I ever expected.
I was aware of the problems, just I didn't choose to focus in on them. And then once I started realizing, hey, you know, I'm going to be living in this world for a while and my kids will hopefully be here, I started to think maybe I should get involved, you know, find more out about where I live and what's going on. So maybe in the future I could help prevent some of the bad things that are going to happen.
If we can't keep a 200-year-old oak tree alive, and we're not making sure that it can have any of its progeny survive, then all of the things that we depend on and take for granted will slowly erode.
We can't lose the knowledge of the land that has been passed on to us. So these trees have luckily stayed around long enough for us to finally start learning our lessons.
It's educating people that you can do something out there to actually change it. It seems really futile to a lot of people to plant an oak sapling because it won't be a tree in your lifetime. And people are so into immediate gratification now. I'm so grateful when I look around at these trees, but I know that 75 years ago when this town was formed, they had an ordinance on the east side that you had to plant 11 trees in your yard. So somebody back then had a vision. Somewhere along the line, it got lost. So we just need to pick it back up and put it back in place again.
Now we're talking about, okay, creating an environment for people to live in for future generations. You know, we're all always under pressure to maximize the return on our assets that we own. But what we don't own is the future for our children.
We think so much in terms of the next few years, 5 years, 10 years, and that sort of horizon of how long my family's going to be here, and I want shade in X number of years, and as a village, you know, well, we want a tree that fits between, you know, the power lines are here. We get all these sort of qualifications in there, and there just isn't any place for these large, beautiful trees, and it's about reorganizing our values and realizing why these are such beautiful places to live in and what role those trees are playing and everyone getting together and realizing that they're not going to be there unless we address that.
If we start losing that connection to our heritage, to what the land means to us, there's no hope for us. If we can't do something to preserve that, if we can't do something, if we can't make some sacrifice now to preserve that, we really have to ask, you know, what are we willing to preserve? What are we willing to protect?
You can just see from this yard, it has a structure that we really enjoy as human beings. It has those big old trees with a lot of dappled sunlight between them, and we play the role of grazers and of landscape scale fire with our lawnmowers. We keep the vegetation low, and that's one of our favorite structures to look out at, large trees and a mowed lawn. When the French arrived in the 1600s to the Midwest, their commentary on the oaks and the groves that they see is exemplary. One journal says that the oak groves look as though they are apple orchards planted by the hand of God for the pleasure of man.